starring Sandro Radwanowski, Sonia Ganassi, Oren Gradus, and Shalva Mukeria, conducted by Antonello Alemandi. There will be 7 more performances through October the 6th. Now, this is Donizetti's take on the most famous sequence of marriages in English history, the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. The particular story we are dealing with is the fall of wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. And the story involves actually the first 3 wives of Henry VIII. In case you have not watched The Tudors lately, let me give you a little bit of the historical background. The fate of the first 3 wives of Henry VIII was all wrapped up in Henry's quest to find a male heir to succeed him as king. Now, this is not an unreasonable ambition, because 16th century Europe is rife with civil wars caused when there was no clear heir to the throne in a particular country. Henry VIII was willing to go to rather extraordinary lengths to get that male heir, though. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him 1 child, a daughter, Mary. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was getting out of the childbearing years, and Henry's attention turned to one of her ladies-in-waiting, a woman named Anne Boleyn. She first comes into his life in 1526. By 1531, Henry has decided to break things off with Catherine permanently. He moves her out of the palace, he moves Anne in, and he asks the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine on a technicality. The Pope refused to do it, and Henry famously broke the English Church away from the Roman Catholic Church. And then got the Archbishop of Canterbury to give him the annulment he sought. So in 1533, he officially marries Anne Boleyn. And Anne bears him a child too, but it's another girl, the Princess Elizabeth. And she is unable to bring forth a male heir. And so Henry decides to turn his attention to one of her ladies-in-waiting. This time it's a woman named Jane Seymour. But the way he manages to break off his marriage with Anne Boleyn is rather more extreme. He accuses her in 1536 of adultery. Adultery with a whole group of people, with a Flemish musician in her court named Mark Smeaton, with the poet Thomas Wyatt, with her own brother. It's a bit of a kangaroo court, and she is duly convicted, and she is beheaded in 1536, and Henry openly marries Jane Seymour, who finally gives him the male heir he seeks, but she dies in childbirth, giving birth to that heir, who will be eventually the King Edward VI. So that is the historical background in a nutshell. Now, Donizetti and his librettist, Felice Romani, take this story up for an opera in 1830. Romani was one of the great librettists of his day. He worked with all the major composers of his time. He, for example, crafted the libretto for The Elixir of Love, for La Sonnambula, which Washington Concert Opera is doing over at Lisner tomorrow by Vincenzo Bellini, for Norma, which the Washington National Opera presents this coming spring. When Romani constructed a libretto on a historical subject, the aim was not really historical accuracy. Nobody goes to the opera for a history lesson, not really. Nor was it often even really plausibility. The historian John Rosselli puts it very well. He says, in an opera of this period, the idea is to create the maximum emotional tension so then you can have the maximum emotional release in the music. And Romani certainly does that. And one of the ways he does it is by centering the story not just on Anne Boleyn, but also on the woman who would succeed her, Jane Seymour, who in Italian libretto is called Giovanna Seymour. We are going to start tonight's musical section of the program with a scene between Jane Seymour and King Henry. Happens early in Act 1. Jane is consumed with shame at her position as the king's mistress. She doesn't want that. She wants to have a virtuous and reputable life. And she goes to Henry and tells him that she wants to break things off. And he says, well, what is it you want? She says, amore e fama. I want love and I want fame, but fame in the sense of a good reputation. And he says, there is no better reputation than being loved by King Henry VIII. And she says to him, my true reputation can only be gained at the foot of the wedding altar. And you know, and heaven knows, that that path is forbidden to me. Now, Henry, in Donizetti and Romani's telling, is a deeply suspicious and very, very volatile guy. And he accuses Jane right away of coveting the throne. And then he explicitly compares her to Anne. He said, Anne also offered me love when she wanted the English throne. But as soon as she got it, it became unsteady on her head. Jane protests. She's about to leave when Henry does something very unexpected that takes the conversation in a whole new direction. He tells her to stop, that he will make her queen. And she says, what about Anne? And he says, Anne has committed the most wicked of all crimes, and the day of punishment has come. She gave me a heart that was not hers to give. She has betrayed me, and she must pay. And Jane says to him, but what will you do? And he says, io sol lo so. I am the only one that knows. I won't reveal that yet. A little bit for me to know and you to find out. We will hear now the duet from Act 1 of Anabolena between Giovanna Seymour and Henry VIII. As Giovanna Seymour, we hear mezzo-soprano Julia Mincer. As Enrico VIII, we hear bass Solomon Howard. At the piano, Rafael Andrade.
Questa guisa ama Seymour, ingrata e che bramone. sia presta, avri sposo e cetro e soglio.
Cielo e mamma,
Illario,
oceani,
tutte giorni ponine,
assi,
la punina. Emi un coro che suo non era, m'ingannò, criatezza e muore ancora m'ingannò.
i suoi modi,
Il re e Giulio,
con quale mezzo,
io solo so, io solo so.
Well, from that moment on, Anne's fate is sealed. Henry starts plotting to figure out how he's going to get rid of her. And he decides to take advantage of an old liaison of hers. She had been involved with a man named Riccardo Percy before she married Henry. And Henry's plan is to bring Percy back to England. He's been banished for a while, but he's going to bring him back and get him in contact with Anne and see if he can entrap Anne doing something untoward. Now, this is a good place to talk about the historical truth and dramatic liberties, because Anne Boleyn really was involved with a guy named Percy before she married Henry VIII. His name wasn't Riccardo or Richard, it was Henry, but there's already a Henry in this story, so that's the first thing that has to change. Also, the real Henry Percy turns out to be not so faithful a lover. He eventually sat on the jury that sent Anne to her death. So we prefer Donizetti's version. He's just a more sympathetic lover to have at the center of the story. What we're going to see now is the moment where Riccardo Percy comes back to the court of Henry VIII. And Henry tells him that it is Anne who has interceded for him and been his deliverer. And he bends to kiss her hand in gratitude. And there ensues one of those moments that bel canto opera does better than anything else. Bel canto being the period of Italian opera from Rossini through Donizetti and Bellini. Bel canto opera specializes in these moments where time sort of stops, where a single moment is expanded, slowed down, so you can see exactly what it means in 5 or 6 different lives. In this case, it's a little bit like those gunfights in The Matrix, you know, where all of a sudden the bullets are moving so slowly. In this case, it's the moment where Percy kisses Anne's hand, and you get to hear from each character in the scene what it means. Anne says, "I felt his tears fall on my hand, and what a fire they woke in my heart." Percy says, it's true then, she thought of me all these years while I was gone, and she still loves me. Henry is plotting with his servant, or his henchman, let's say, Sir Hervé, and says, it's going to be your job to watch them. Don't let a single conversation, a single glance out of your sight. And Anne's brother, Lord Rochefort, who is also Percy's best friend, is warning him. He says, it's all too clear on your face, the turmoil that you have in your heart. Let's hear then this quintet from Act 1 of Anabolena, in addition to Solomon Howard as Henry VIII. You will hear Mauricio Miranda as Sir Hervé, Norman Garrett as Lord Rochefort, Yuri Gorodetsky as Percy, and as Anabolena, Maria Eugenia Antunes. Henry's not a great guy, but he's a pretty good plotter because the plan works. In fact, with the help of Anne's brother, Lord Rochefort, Percy finds his way to Anne's chambers secretly. And he confronts her. And she says to him, "We need to speak briefly and quietly. Can you not see that I am now a wife, that I am the queen?" And he says to her, "No, Anna per me tu sei, Anna soltanto. You're not a wife, you're not the queen, you are only Anna to me." Those of you who know Rigoletto will hear when he sings that a little echo of the Duke's second act aria, or actually a preview of the Duke's second act aria. It's obvious that Verdi knew this score. So Percy persists, and he says, "Isn't it true that things have changed? Isn't it true that the king hates you?" And Anne admits it. She says, "Si, m'aborre." He hates me. And Percy says, "Se t'aborre, io t'amo ancora." He may hate you, but I love you still. I loved you when you were lowly, and I love you now. And pleads with him to give this mad hope up. She tells him she's already in danger, that there's fear and suspicion on her pillow every night when she lies down. But he says to her, "Al tuo pied trafitto e spento." If you ask it, I will fall at your feet, mortally wounded, but only let me stay, if all I get to do is sigh, because even suffering near you is better than life anywhere else. Let's hear the duet for Anna and Percy from Act 1 of Anabolena. Once again, here's Maria Eugenia Antunes as Anabolena, as Riccardo Percy, Yuri Gorodetsky.
insegno primiero e non aborre il re
mi abborre il vero.
sei abborre io t'amo ancora qual t'amavo in basso stato
Shortly after that, who do you think turns up in Anne's chambers? Yep, Henry. And he finds Percy there. He also finds somebody that neither Anna nor Percy knew was there, and that's the musician Mark Smeaton. Remember him? One of the people who in history was actually accused of infidelities with Anne. Smeaton in this story is a boy musician who has secretly fallen in love with Anne. He has actually stolen a locket with her portrait, which he has kept close to his heart for a long time, but he's afraid now and he's trying to return it. And while he tries to return it to Anne's chambers, he gets stuck there. So Henry turns up and finds Smeaton and Percy and Anne, and accuses her publicly of infidelity and has her sent to the Tower. What about Jane Seymour in all of this? Well, in the Donizetti, Jane is horrified at this turn of events. She will go to Henry in Act 2 and plead for Anne's life. And the aria that she does it in is called Per questa fiamma indomita. She says to Henry, for the sake of this flame inside me that I cannot tame, for the sake of the tears that this love has cost me, do not let Anne perish on my account. Rea non mi far di più. Do not make me more guilty than I already am. And she goes on to say, remember that the eyes of heaven and on earth are all on you. And if a king must be harsh, let my Henry be merciful. We'll hear the aria Per questa fiamma indomita, sung by mezzo-soprano Julia Mincer.
Thank you.
Before we close, I'd like to thank two people. First of all, Mr. Rafael Andrade at the keyboard. And also Nick Olcott of the University of Maryland for staging all these scenes so beautifully. We're going to close with one of the great confrontation duets in all of opera, the meeting of the two queens, the current queen and the queen to be. Because in the beginning of Act 2 of Donizetti's version, Jane Seymour comes to visit Anne in prison. And she tells Anne that there's only one way to save her life, and that is to confess. She says, if you confess, you can save your life even if you don't save your royal name. And Anne is shocked that one of her own ladies-in-waiting would ask her to sacrifice her honor in order to save her life. You know, that these two women have very obvious parallels that they both can see. Anne, throughout the show, feels very, very guilty about how she got to the throne. She talks about how the crime that she committed against that poor woman, Catherine of Aragon, must not go unavenged. And now she sees the sort of karmic wheel turning, and she is going to be replaced in the same way. And these parallels are not lost on Jane Seymour either. Well, Jane begs her to confess. She says, the king begs you to confess. Even the poor woman whom Henry has destined through the throne begs you to confess. And Anne explodes. She says, who is she? Who would dare counsel her queen to such a cowardly course of action? And she calls forth a terrible curse. She says, may a punishing God's arm come down heavily upon her. May she lie down in the royal bed only to find fear and suspicion. May my specter rise up between her and her guilty husband. And may the king eventually refuse her the swift axe that he is granting to me. And Jane is appalled. She breaks down completely, and that's when Anne realizes that her rival is, in fact, her own lady-in-waiting. And she's shocked. And Jane begs for Anne to understand. She says, I was naive. I was seduced. I love Henry, and I'm ashamed of this love. But my tears, no matter how many I cry, will not extinguish it. And then Anne does something rather extraordinary. She forgives Jane Seymour. She says, the only guilty one is the man who has woken this passion in you. And she says, go forth with the pardon of Anabolena. I will ask God for it on your behalf, and he will grant it to me. And Jane says, this pardon is worse than the hatred I feared, because I know that a just God awaits me in heaven, and he will not have the mercy that you have just had. We will hear once again Maria Eugenia Antunes as Anabolena, as Jane Seymour. We'll hear mezzo-soprano Julia Mincer.
Thank you. Fatto